We are in the fourth week of our Easter message series, When Life Gives You Lemons. Easter tends to be a pretty cheery time of the year, but this year feels different. In the shadow of the coronavirus, we are in uncharted territory. And in that way, it's very much like the experience of that first Easter. The apostles didn't wake up that first Easter morning filled with confidence and hope for the future. Instead, they were filled with fear and doubt. Their world had just been rocked by Jesus' death on the cross. Their hopes and their dreams for the future were sealed with Jesus in the tomb. They were unsettled and worried, much like many of us are today. But that mood changed through the course of that first Easter season. As they discovered the empty tomb and interacted with the risen Jesus, their mood and their perspective on life changed completely. As they came to faith in the risen Jesus, they discovered a renewed sense of hope and confidence in the future. And so while we find ourselves in this mentally and emotionally draining time, we're exploring how we can squeeze the most out of this season, how God calls us to grow and experience life change, not despite our difficult circumstances, but because of them and through them, how to make lemonade from the lemons in our lives. Today we're looking at a very practical way to grow in a time of crisis. It might not be exciting or even flashy, and for many of us, it's really hard. But nonetheless, if you can start on the path to develop this habit, you'll find yourself thriving in even the worst of circumstances. We're going to use the passage we just read from the 10th chapter of St. John's Gospel as our guide. Jesus here is speaking to the religious leaders, and in his speech, he uses imagery that would have been very familiar to them, that of a shepherd. At the end of the day, a shepherd would bring the sheep to a sheepfold, where several herds of sheep would be kept. A sheepfold was an enclosure with stone walls that protected the sheep from thieves or wild animals looking for prey. A guard would be stationed at the entrance of the gate, both to protect the sheep and to keep the sheep inside the enclosure. Jesus first states the obvious, that anyone who's not using the gate to enter this enclosure is likely a thief who's up to no good. And then he continues, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So in the morning, the shepherd would come to collect their own flock. Once the shepherd had the fold opened for him by the gatekeeper, the shepherd would have a special call for his sheep, unique from any other shepherd. The sheep knew the voice of their own shepherd. After all, they heard it every day, and they would be able to distinguish it easily. So when they heard the call of their own shepherd, they would follow him, and only him. Now, of course, to a casual observer, all sheep seem to be the same. But the shepherd knew his sheep, and he even named them. The shepherd would then lead them out of the pen and into the fields for a happy day of grazing. There are certain voices you recognize. They bring comfort and security. As a child, you recognize the voice of your parents. Maybe you can recall a time as a kid when you were separated from your parents at the supermarket or even at the mall, and you were scared and alone. And then you heard the voice of your parents, and you knew that everything would be okay. Now that you're older, it might be the voice of your spouse or of a good friend. When they call you, you recognize their voice right away. When you hear their greeting, your ears perk up and it brings joy to your heart. We especially love hearing our names said when we feel alone. Like being at a party where you don't know anyone and you feel out of place. And then you hear a friendly voice call out your name. There's a joy in being known and seen. Well, Jesus says that this is the way he knows his flock, his people. He knows each follower's name. He has a unique way of calling out to them. He knows each one of them well. And then he continues. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. The shepherd would lead them out of the pen to go about their day. They would lead the sheep in the right direction to places of provision, food and water and rest, and protect them from wild animals and other threats that could come along the way. Now notice what Jesus says about the shepherd. The shepherd walks ahead of the sheep. He doesn't walk behind him, but he leads his flock. Not because he's important, but to scout out potential problems, like an attack from wild animals, or even a wrong turn that would lead the sheep off of a cliff. The shepherd goes on ahead, so he knows what's coming. In the same way, Jesus goes on ahead of you. Your future is not a surprise to him. He walks ahead of you. He knows the wrong turns and the cliffs that you should avoid. He sees the things that are going to attack your heart and your mind. He knows the events that are going to fill you with fear and concern and worry. He knows the pitfalls and the problems. But he also knows the places of provision. He knows the places where you can find refreshment for your heart and your soul and your mind and your body. He walks ahead of you and wants to lead you to those places of nourishment and peace. And then Jesus continues. The sheep will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Now, people say that sheep are dumb, right? Well, when you call someone a sheep, it's usually an insult, meaning that they're gullible or that they can't think for themselves. Now, true, sheep are pretty simple animals, but there is something that they do get right. They're smart enough not to follow the voice of a stranger. While they follow the voice of the shepherd who cares for them, they run away from the voice of strangers. Now, people generally tend to follow the voices that are familiar to them, whether they can help it or not. Have you ever caught a friend, or better yet, your own teenage child, listening to someone, like a YouTuber or a news station, and immediately it grated on you? Instantly, you were concerned about who they were listening to. You could see so clearly that this voice or person was leading them into fear or bitterness or anger, and not to anything good. That concern is an indication that you care about that person and the influences that they're opening themselves up to. But have you ever thought about this for yourself? Are there some voices that you listen to simply because they are familiar to you? But if you step back and evaluated them, you would admit that they are not filling you with hope or confidence or faith, but maybe with bitterness or fear or worry. Jesus says that his followers listen to his voice, not to any other. They're solely focused and attuned to the shepherd's directions. And it's for their own benefit that they do that too, because, as Jesus concludes, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So Jesus contrasts himself with the thief, and not necessarily just with someone looking to break into your house either. There are thieves out there looking to steal your peace of your mind and your hope and your joy. They're the thieves who leave behind worry, fear, anxiety, distrust, and discord. They kill and destroy your future, your relationships, and your life. And when you listen to those voices, my friends, you are letting them rob you. Jesus said that he came so that you can have life and have it more abundantly. As you listen to the voice of Jesus, he leads you to abundant peace and abundant joy and to an abundant confidence in the future. And so that's a way that we should seek to grow during this time. In fact, in all times. We ought to grow in our intimacy with Jesus Christ so that we can hear the voice of our shepherd. If we learn to better hear and discern the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, he will lead us to a place of provision and peace. If we learn to hear his voice, we know we have a future full of hope because he is the Good Shepherd who has already laid down his life for us. He is the Good Shepherd who goes before us. Jesus' words bring abundant life. Now, this doesn't mean that his words are always easy to hear either. Sometimes his words are challenging, especially if we've wandered off course. Jesus wants to protect us. The abundant life comes from listening to the voice of Jesus, becoming more and more familiar with his voice. So we follow him, and not the voices of the strangers who don't have our best interests at heart. So how does one grow in their ability to hear Jesus' voice? Well, I'm really glad you asked. These steps are simple, but they aren't just something that you do once and then that's it. They require a bit of a lifestyle change, a conscious choice and an effort that you'll have to come to over and over again and refine them, just like you would any other good habit. So the first is to ask Jesus to speak to you. See, Jesus respects your free will and autonomy. He wants to speak to you, but you have to ask to hear his voice. You have to invite his voice into your life and into your heart. So begin by asking Jesus to hear his voice. Secondly, turn down the noise. You need some space and some silence for Jesus. It's impossible to hear Jesus if you have all this other noise going on in your life. And I'm personally speaking from experience, because it is a noisy world out there. Jesus won't be made to jockey for position and compete with all of the other things that are going on in your life. Instead, he patiently waits for us to make space for him to speak. He doesn't talk to us out loud, but in our hearts, that's where he speaks to us. The only way we can hear him is by having periods of silence, a daily quiet time for prayer and reflection. The third key to hearing his voice is to read from the Gospels. You recognize the voice of a loved one because you know how they speak and the words that they use well as their tone of voice. Likewise, you will recognize Jesus' voice as you become more and more familiar with the words that he used and how he interacts with other people in the Gospels. See, the Gospels give us Jesus' words, and Jesus has specific words for you. He knows your name, and he knows you personally. But in order for you to hear those words and to hear what he has to say to you, you need to become more familiar with the Gospels. Just pay attention to how Jesus addresses the people. Imagine the tone of voice that he used when he was speaking to them. And I know, it can be daunting, but we have a great tool to help you easily break down and digest the Gospels. They are our daily devos. A little tidbit of the weekly gospel with a short reflection and then a prayer prompt. Something to help you dive into the Gospels without feeling totally overwhelmed by them either. And then That helps you to squeeze the most out of the Gospels. Now, you can sign up today. Just visit our website. Go to stalphonsus.net and click on Daily Devotionals. And you can subscribe and start receiving those devos into your inbox right away each morning. It is a wonderful way to hear from the Good Shepherd each and every day. Friends, I want to close today with the words of the 23rd Psalm. I find these words very peaceful and very calming. And maybe these are the words you need to hear today. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.